process called collect requirements. And the purpose here is to understand exactly what is needed to satisfy the stakeholders and capturing this in the requirements documentation. If you think about the fact that everything emanates from the requirements, you can see what a powerful process this is, and it's imperative that this is 100% complete. Get the requirements wrong, you'll get the scope wrong, and you'll get the cost, time and quality wrong. So it all starts here. What inputs do we use? Well, the scope management plan, because this describes how this particular process and the remaining ones are to be managed. And it also helps to clarify the requirements that the team will need to gather. The requirements management plan describes how the requirements will be collected and documented. Remember that the requirements are the main tool used to understand and manage the all-important stakeholder expectations. And as I've already said, schedule, budget, quality, risk and others all feed back to the requirements itself. The stakeholder management plan describes exactly who the stakeholders are and how each individual or group needs to be managed and how much they need to be involved within the requirements process. The project charter, because of course it has a high-level description of the project end product, and the stakeholder register, as this contains a list of all of the stakeholders. And it's these individuals and groups that will help ensure that we accurately capture all the requirements. Making sure, and it's absolutely vital that we involve the correct stakeholders here, because if partway through the project we discover we spoke to the wrong people, then that would be an absolute project disaster. So the main outputs here is the requirements documentation, laying out precisely what needs to be formed and why each particular requirement is important. We'll look at this document in more detail shortly. The second output, and the final output here, is the requirements traceability matrix. And this is used to identify the source of each of the requirements, which could be an individual source or a department or an organisation. If a particular individual, as an example, stated that one of the requirements is there should be a certain response speed on a piece of equipment, then it's important to know who it was that gave that information. Okay, the tools used in collect requirements, there are quite a few here. Let me show them all to you because I shall be describing these in a separate slide simply because there are so many of them. Just be aware here they all are, and we'll go into that in a moment. Still staying with the collecting requirements process, you will now know that requirements are the primary means of understanding and managing stakeholder expectations, and such requirements will have a profound impact on all other aspects of the project, ending up in the formally approved project management plan. A change to any one of these requirements can change some or all of these aspects. I'm sure you can see easily how a new requirement would affect the budget and schedule, but it may have an impact on others as well. Now the develop project charter process, out of that we get the idea. Now as I showed you earlier, the develop project charter process will feed into identify stakeholders, which we'll be doing in a much later module, and give us the stakeholder register, as I've said. We're now in collecting requirements and we will develop the project scope statement. It's important that you know before I lead any further that this is an iterative loop, and we'll find that by creating the project scope statement there'll almost certainly be one or more individuals for all the right reasons saying we need to change the requirements or we need to add the requirements, and that'll cause this loop to be gone through at least once. It's very rare that you can go out and collect all the requirements, then produce a project scope statement to find that everyone says it's exactly what we asked for, please start work. There'll almost always be some different views. I said to you that I'd go into the tools and requirements in a separate slide, so let's do that now. I'll deal with these one at a time. Interviews, often conducted by the project manager or by some subject matter expert, who can be very helpful in describing what requirements a particular product should contain, and of course why that's important. Focus groups. Focus groups are often done on one-to-one despite the name, but it can be one individual conducting a fact-finding session with a group of stakeholders. The objective here is to understand their needs and requirements. Facilitated workshops, getting everyone in one room is a very good thing to do, and using that facilitated workshop to determine exactly what the requirements are. It's important to have a professional facilitator here, and don't just get the project manager to do it, as the project manager will almost certainly need to be involved in the discussions. Questionnaires and surveys, very efficient way of gathering requirements, although you wouldn't want to do this on your own since it's not face to face, but you can use email for this and get a great deal of data. Prototypes. This in effect is a model of either the end product or a key part of it, and having those in a room with appropriate stakeholders using this as a discussion point can be very useful in tying down precisely what requirements should be. Prototyping is used, for example, within agile projects. And observation. This normally means someone watching another individual carrying out their job to understand exactly how this job is carried out and to capture any requirements that you may not have got by simply asking. Group creativity techniques. There's quite a few here. You've probably heard of brainstorming, where you'd normally have someone with a flip chart and you gather in a very free and fast open way any ideas and requirements and keep going till everyone is dry of ideas and then go through each one that's been raised and put that onto a requirements list or modify it or what have you. The Delphi technique is an interesting technique which I've used several times for estimating. The idea here is you don't get everyone in a room at all. It stops people being intimidated by perhaps their boss or senior people, or out of respect for someone who they happen to know is an absolute guru. Using email here is a great way of carrying this out, where you get everyone's input by email to allow an individual to give their true thoughts and genuine ideas, their real opinion, if you will. Affinity diagram, which helps gather common ideas. Ideas and mind mapping. You're familiar with mind maps, I'm sure. It's a great way for a team, perhaps on a large whiteboard, to create the graphical map and identify associations between the various ideas. Nominal group technique. This is where you would use brainstorming to get ideas, but they're voted upon and sorted by priority. Group decision-making techniques. Basically, this is an approach to how, as it says, you get a decision out of a group. It's an assessment process of multiple alternatives with an expected outcome in the form of future actions resolution. Doesn't really help a lot, that definition. Let me help you a little. It's used to generate, classify and prioritize product requirements. A suggestion is that you could use one or more of these approaches to actually come to this final decision. Let's start with unanimity. This is similar to a jury where everybody must agree with the decision before the actual decision is made. Plurality. This is where the largest block of individuals decides the outcome. Here voting is not involved, it's merely the outcome that most people in the room agree with. Majority. This is different to plurality in that it's a simple majority of votes, if you will, just like an election. That's different to having differing opinions and looking for the largest vote on an opinion. Consensus. This is helpful where there are differing views in the room, but everyone agrees to support the outcome, even if they don't all agree entirely with the decision. The one I've left till last is dictatorship. If you see an exam question on this, this is the least satisfactory. As you might imagine, this is one person making the decisions for the entire group. Next up, we'll look at the requirements documentation. Now, this describes what needs to be performed and why each requirement is important to the project objectives. Requirements documentation must be unambiguous. That means it must be measurable and testable, with no room for opinion. It must be traceable, in other words, back to the source, from the source to which area this is going to be relevant in. It must be complete, consistent and acceptable to the key stakeholders. Now, first a general discussion about requirements documentation, and then we'll look in a bit more detail. This needs to contain the business need, the opportunity, the objectives, goals or problem to be solved, of course. It should have the method that each requirement uses to address the problem. It should include both functional and non-functional requirements. And it must include how the business processes interact with the requirements. Each requirement must have an acceptance criteria, and it must include any impacts to internal or external organisational areas. We need to capture, like any good plans, any assumptions we're making about requirements and any constraints. This will be very helpful when we come to defining the scope. And each requirement must contain information on the source. We also need to capture the source of each requirement. So the Requirements Management Plan document describes the team activities needed to gather and manage and document the project requirements. It's a how-to. How decisions and changes will be made and handled. What would you expect to see in a requirements management plan? How the requirements will be gathered and how they'll be managed, how to elaborate on existing requirements, if appropriate, the method used for documenting requirements, how decisions will be made regarding such requirements, and how you will use traceability. Do you remember the document called the Requirements Traceability Matrix, which describes exactly the source of the requirements? Relationships between and among requirements and the methods for verifying and validating them. And do you remember in the last module I talked about configuration management, how configuration management and change control will be applied to potential changes to the requirements. The Requirements Traceability Matrix, which I mentioned up here, this shows the origin of each requirement, an individual, group or an organisation, plus its status, who owns each requirement, what the acceptance criteria is, and any links back into the business and the project objectives, and so on and so forth.